Welcome to Train Signal. I'm Mel Haynes, and you're watching SQL Server 2008 Database Administration. And in this video, we'll be focusing on one of my favorite features in SQL Server, and that is replication, because replication allows you to do some really cool stuff with distributing your data around the network to make it available to your various users. But here, our topics we'll get into. First of all, what is replication in a little more detail than I've done so far, as well as what are some of the benefits? Why do I need it in the first place, right? That's always a key question to ask yourself. Secondly, we'll talk about two main categories of replication just to give you a feel for, at a high level, how is it utilized, and then break into three specific types of replication. And I'll just give you a heads up. Those three types are going to be transactional, snapshot, and merge, and we'll look at all three of those, and we'll actually implement transactional. Fourth, SQL Server will play various roles inside of a replication paradigm. We'll look at those roles. We'll look at the players, I call it. What are the SQL Server agents specific to replication, or the replication agents? Next, we'll get into replication configuration, and that's where we'll spend the bulk of our time actually going through and configuring our servers to do replication. Now, when I say configuring replication, that's going to include, first of all, determining what accounts I'm going to use for administering SQL Server replication. We'll do that. And I'm going to break away from a bad habit that some of you may be doing and encourage you to focus on using something other than your Windows administration account. So we're going to set up a domain account for administering our SQL servers. That's not necessary for replication, but it's definitely recommended. Then we'll get into configuring your firewall so that your SQL Server boxes on different servers can communicate and send the information back and forth that they need to send. Third, under configuring replication, we'll look at installing SQL Server replication. And you're thinking, well, we already installed SQL Server. That is true, but you didn't, hopefully, install replication earlier simply because you didn't need it. Now, you may have anticipated needing it. That's great, but a good rule of thumb, you don't want to install services that you're not going to use. SQL Server provides all types of different services for you to utilize. And for protection and for maximum security, you want to minimize installing things you don't need. Fourth, we'll get into enabling replication, and that will also entail creation of a distribution database. We'll then go into creating the publication. Replication uses a newspaper publication subscription paradigm that we're going to walk through, and one of the first things in that is creating something to publish, a publication, followed by configuring the person that reads the publication, known as a subscriber. So after creating the publication, we'll configure a subscriber to that publication, and then we create what's known as an actual subscription. So yes, it carries that paradigm all the way out to that degree, because the subscription determines when do you get the paper, right? Not what the paper is going to contain. So that's the third part of that. Then we verify that they actually received the information that was supposed to be sent. Following that configuration portion, we'll get into some best practices, and I'm not going to get into a huge list, but a few simple rules that should be in place almost across the board for any replication implementation. And then you will come across some new words in this video, and we're going to wrap up by reviewing what they are. So let's talk a little bit about Veronica's business here. So we've got a great business humming along here. Things are blooming, pun intended, right? And you got a problem that arises. We're growing. So Veronica's increases in size dramatically. So now we've got much larger data management issues to contend with. So one thing we can do is say, hey, we've got one corporate office managing the information for customers all around the country. It's time to open branch offices. So we decided to move out to Boise, because those good Boise folks in Idaho are just slamming away, selling flowers like you've never seen before. And same thing down in Florida. We've got our folks down in Naples. Now, of course, the folks in Naples and the folks in Boise are buying different stuff, but that doesn't matter. We've given them a local office, and they have access to their data, as well as the folks now out in the Southwest, over in Phoenix. And then we start moving off coast. So we've got people in San Juan and any place else that we can get to from San Juan buying our stuff, and they're all hitting our server back in our corporate office for most of their data. That could be a problem. That could be a big problem. Because one, if the local server goes down, gee, everybody's down. Now, that was always a problem before, but now we've got a lot more people dependent on a single server, which brings up another point. You've got a lot more people dependent upon a single remote location. You want to avoid that if possible. So we want to decentralize our data and get the information that is most important to each office closer to that office. So let's look at the scenario again. Instead of a single Chicago office, which is what we started with, let's decentralize. We have a San Juan office and a Naples office. They're not huge yet, but we want to give them something off Chicago, so we open an eastern region, put both those offices on that same server. We've got a Boise office. They're big enough, doing enough business where we give them their own server under the North Central office or North Central region. And then the same thing with Phoenix. Phoenix is handling everything else west, so we put them on a new western server. And now from Chicago, we can replicate the information that's pertinent to that office at some predetermined interval, giving each office their own server with the data that they need to run their business. And then that data is updated, as I said before, at some predetermined interval. That's replication. That's the solution that will get us off of a single centralized server. So what is replication? Replication is about distributing data and distributing database objects. So far we've only talked about data, but if you think about what's in an SQL Server database, you know there's more than just data, right? There's the tables, whether or not there's data in them or not. There's all the triggers on those tables, any constraints you've defined. There's stored procedures, user-defined functions. Any of those other database objects, to use the SQL Server term, that are part of your database. All of that can be, and typically is, replicated. Second is data redundancy. So not only do I have a copy of the information for the eastern region in the central office, but it's also replicated out to the eastern office. So you have two copies of the data. And third, hopefully this should give you some faster access for two reasons. One, you don't have all these users contending for resources at a central server. And second, they're not having to traverse quite the same distance to get to that data. Now, server to server is one particular category of replication. With server to server, as the title says, you're replicating information out to other servers. And in the scenario we're looking at so far with Veronica's, that's what we're doing. We have other remote servers that then clients at those locations can hit that local server to have access to their data. Another variation, however, would be server to client, where, say in the case of remote POS systems, or if you've ever returned a rental car nowadays, they come to your car with a little handheld client device that has information about what rate you signed up for and other information about your rental, and they're able to finish your transaction locally using a client device that's getting information from some centralized server. Now moving on to SQL Server replication roles. There are basically three. SQL Server can operate as a publisher, the one creating or the author or centralized owner of the data. SQL Server can operate as a distributor, the one responsible for passing it out, and then the subscriber, the one that's receiving that information. But here, let's look at those in a little different light. First of all, your publisher is basically the source of the information, and is responsible for creating what's known as a publication. The distributor stores the replicated data and then is responsible for passing that out and communicating with the various subscribers. You don't have to have a separate box for distributor and publisher. It's actually very common to have both of those operating on the same server. You only need to look at breaking those into two separate servers if your data demands and the amount of work going on in your environment requires that. And then third, we have our subscribers, the boxes that are actually receiving that information. Now, how they get the information can be triggered by either the publisher or the subscriber, known as either push when it's coming from the publisher or pull when the request is coming from the subscriber. But we'll look at all that coming up. And then there's the players. What are the key processes running with replication? First of all, anytime anything is happening automatically in SQL Server land, there's always the SQL Server agent involved. And in this case, I'm simply calling it the boss because it's always the driving process. It's not specific to replication. It applies to anything running automatically, backups, anything. Snapshot agent, however, is specific to replication, and it's actually used in all forms of replication because the first thing you do with replication is create an initial snapshot, a starting point for your replication. There's the log reader agent. This is used in your transactional replication, which makes sense. Every time a transaction occurs, you replicate that out to your subscribers, and you use a log reader agent to read the log to initiate that. It's going to extract and send you transactions from your publisher's log file. There's the distribution agent. It's kind of like your dispatcher. It's passing out the information to the various subscribers at the predetermined intervals. And then there's a merge agent if you're using merge replication. It's used for merging the data that's now being changed not only at the central publisher, but also at the remote subscribers. So here, let's look at the steps that go into replication configuration. Starting with, you'll typically want to have your boxes all within a domain. So we're going to quickly walk you through that process. Won't spend as much time there, but I do want to point out that you typically will operate inside of a single domain. Second, you'll want to create the accounts that you'll need for replication. In our case, we're going to use domain accounts. Now, you can use some local accounts, but we're going to go with domain accounts for ease of administration. Third, there's a firewall that's in place by default with Windows Server 2008. You will need to configure the firewall to allow SQL Server to have access through the firewall. Fourth, you've probably already installed SQL Server 2008, but possibly you haven't installed replication, which is a good thing. Typically, you don't want to install anything you're not going to use, so we'll walk you through installing replication now that we're at the point where we actually need it. 5, we configure distribution. That's going to entail creating a distribution database as well as those replication accounts that we talked about in step 2. They will need to have access to the various folders that are created as part of configuring distribution. Number 6, we get to create our publication. That'll be the collection of articles, which are what? Data and database objects that we're going to replicate. Number 7, we configure the subscriber, who's going to receive the information and what changes need to be made over there. Number 8, we create a subscription. That's the plan for who gets what. And then number 9, we verify that the data was actually replicated over to the subscriber. And by the way, number 9, you can put a repeat loop there because you're going to typically want to do that on a very regular basis. So we're going to start with adding computers to the domain. Now, I'm not going to spend as much detail here simply because we've done that quite a bit, and that's really more outside of the scope of SQL Server, but I do want to at least point you in the right direction. So here, let's take a quick look at my server. So looking at my publisher, if I go to Start, right-click on Computer, go to Properties, wait a matter of seconds, and here I can see that this computer, there's the full computer name, is part of the Mel's domain.local. And if it were not, if I go to Change Settings, and here's where I can choose, after it gets me through the security, whether or not I want to be part of, and click Change, a work group, which it is not, versus a domain. So simply clicking Domain, typing in the domain name, prompts me for a user ID and password that has rights to do that, and then it will require a reboot, come back as part of the domain. So that's step 1. Step 2, we want to create our domain accounts, or whatever accounts we're going to be using. Actually, replication doesn't require that all the replication services use domain accounts. We're going to use domain accounts in this example. But at least you should have some domain account for administering the various servers to give you centralized administrative control. So we're going to create accounts, and ours are going to specifically be domain accounts, one for administration, and then we're going to create account for each SQL Server service. So here, let's jump over to our server and create our domain accounts. So here we are in Serverland. I've got 3 servers we're going to be working with. This is going to be my publisher in blue, and I've color coded them to hopefully help keep things straight for you. So this will be my publisher. My subscriber in this bright sunny shade of yellow. Now remember, this is a flowers business, so you get used to it. We got colors happening here. And then my domain controller, I've switched to this wonderful shade of Veronica's lavender. So that'll be my domain controller. Hopefully keep things straight. Now the first thing we want to do, we want to clean something up. We've been operating under the administrator account, which is great for demoing purposes, which is great for doing some configuration stuff initially for setup, but you want to get away from that as soon as possible. So before we go into setting up replication, the first thing I want to do is get away from using my administrator account. All my boxes are part of the same domain, and here, I'll just kind of point you to that real quick. If I go Start, Computer, right-click, go to Properties, I can see that my computer, I can see my computer name, full computer name, which includes the domain there, notice the dot, and then the domain here. Now if I were not already in the domain, if you're not in a domain, I recommend highly you establish a box as your domain controller and then add the other 2 servers to the domain. So you would do that here on the change settings and go change and hit the domain option here as opposed to workgroup. Type in the name of your domain, and when you click OK, it'll prompt you for a user ID and a password that has rights to make the change. It'll take a little while. It'll make that change. You'll need to reboot, and you'll be in the domain. So I've already done that for both my subscriber and my publisher. What I want to do now, however, is create a domain account and then use that domain account to administer my replication across the domain. So first, I want to create that account over on my domain controller. So let's switch back over to our Veronica's Lavender domain controller. And if I go Start, Administrative Tools, Users and Computers, and I'm going to create an account MDM, Mel the Data Master. Go New, User, and I'm just going to go to User Log Name, MDM. That's really all you need to put in there, along with full name. First name, last name, not that important. Just as long as I have a full name in and a user login name, I'm good to go. Click Next. Wants to know password stuff. User does not need to change the password, and it never expires. And put in some password that you can remember. Keeping things simple. Click Next. Click Finish. He's done. So now I need to add MDM to my SQL Server environment. So let's go back over to my first server. Start, Management Studio. I'm still logging in as administrator for now. I think the blue is going to be publisher and subscriber for yellow. If I switch that, just kind of scream at me. Go to Security, go to Logins. You can see it's not there yet. Right click, New Login. Windows Authentication, Search. Locations needs to be changed to point to the domain. My administrator account is the account that has the rights to do this. Go ahead and log in with that. I want the entire domain, Mel's domain. Click OK. Now, MDM. Check names. Found it. Looks good. Click OK. MDM needs to be sysadmin within SQL. Making this guy basically the demigod within SQL Server. Good to go there. And now I need to do this on my other server, my subscriber. I can actually do that from here. Connect Database Engine, since we're all in the same domain. I can actually get to my other server right here. If that doesn't show up in your drop down, you can click Browse, or just type in the server name if you know it. Once again, I'm logging in as administrator over there for now. And I should have rights, and I have rights to do the same over here. Logins, I want to add MDM to the server as well. New login, search, change location to check the domain, entire domain, Mel's domain. So it's looking in the right location now. I put in MDM, have it check the name, finds it, puts in the fully qualified name, click OK. Same thing on server roles. I want it to be system admin over here as well. Click OK. So now MDM, when I log in via as MDM in either server, it'll have the rights and permissions it needs to add any other accounts, add any other services, or anything else it needs to do to administer SQL Server and set up replication. Looking at our replication user accounts again. There are 4 accounts that you can create for replication. And I say can because there's no rule that says you can't create one just general repl_user or whatever you want to call it, but one account for all 4 agents. You can get a little bit better control, a little more fine-tuning of your security by creating a separate account for each service. So I'm going to walk you through it that way. But what's more important to gather from this, because you can choose 1 or 4, but where they need to exist. Now, of course, if you create one account, then that one account has to be everywhere. But if you don't, if you break it up, you need to make sure the snapshot and log reader agent are available on the publisher. They don't need to be set up on the subscriber. But your distribution agent needs to be on both the publisher and the subscriber. Merge agent, if you're using merge replication, will also need to be on both the publisher and the subscriber. Okay, we're back on our domain controller for the next thing I need to do. My replication services need to have access to the system, and that's always granted via a user account. So each service will have its own account, which we're going to go ahead and add those now by going, once again, new, user, full name, and we're going to have 4 of them. We're not going to need all of them right now, but just for completeness, I'm going to give all of them life at the same time. So I need a log reader account. Click next. Kill that. Password never expires. You definitely want to set these passwords to never expire. Well, shouldn't say definitely. There's never a reason to use the word never and always, right? But typically, you don't want these passwords expiring. These are system accounts, and if these passwords expire, your services all lose access to the environment, and all your services stop running. So unless you're in an environment that's ultra security conscious, where even your services need to be constantly monitored and shut off and manually re-enabled, you typically don't want your passwords to expire, right? Now, there is some argument for what if these accounts become compromised. I mean, it's an account like any other, so a user could potentially use these accounts to gain access to the system. That is a valid concern, but that's a decision you'll have to make based on your business requirements. But for now, I'm going to set it to never expire. Put in a password. There's the first one. So REPL log reader. Next will be REPL snapshot. It's not case sensitive, it just looks nicer. Paste that in. Next, same rule on the password here. And I have to clear that before I set that, or it complains. Click next, finish. We need REPL distribution. And these names, by the way, there's nothing magical about the name REPL_. It's just for readability. That way you can look at your user accounts and realize, oh, those accounts are being used for replication. So if you're going through and cleaning out accounts for some reason or another, you have some idea without adding other comments. Just the name itself is kind of self-documenting. That's always a good idea. Distribution. My next account. I love copy paste. REPL distribution. Try and spell it right. If you spell it wrong, it's not the end of the world. Just at least consistently spell it wrong. But if you're better off getting it right. Password never expires. And this last one, we're not going to use it in this video, but I'm putting it here just for completeness. And that is the merge. We're not going to do merge replication, but if you were going to use merge replication, you would want to create a REPL merge account. I'll throw that one in there too. So there, my 4 service accounts that I need are in place. So I'm really done with my domain controller. And now we can move over to configuring replication from our SQL Server box. Administrative tools, users and computers. Give it a few seconds to realize I really meant it. Right click on users, go to new user, and we're going to create MDM for Mel, the data master. User login name will be the same. Don't need a last name. Click next. User does not need to change password and it will never expire. Now, if you have security requirements that require something different for your environment, change that. But for what I'm doing in our environment, that'll be fine. Give it a password you can remember. Click next, click finish. MDM is all set. So I can switch back over. Now we get to configure our firewall. I'm using Windows 2008 Enterprise Server, and as a result I get a firewall in place by default, and SQL Server is very aware of that. You may recall during the install, one of the warnings we got was that, hey, there's a firewall in place, be aware of that. So my clients will not have access by default to my server will not have access by default to the other servers on the network. We need to go in and make some configuration changes to the firewall so that my SQL Server instances on different boxes can actually speak to each other. So let's do that. So we need to punch a couple of holes in our firewalls. And I do that by going Start, right click on Network, go to Properties. Here in the lower left hand corner it says Windows Firewall. Click on that. And firewall is currently running on this box. So going to Change Settings. And it's on, which is a good thing. Go to Exceptions, however, because I want to not disable it, but instead add a port for SQL Server. If I go to Add Programs, there's nothing in the list so far. Hit Add Programs. Scroll down, there's a few things already here for SQL Server. Notice Server Error and Usage Reporting, Installation Center, and Management Studio are already there. Just for convenience, I'm going to go ahead and add that. It'll allow me to administer either server from either server, right? So I'd allow SQL Server Management Studio to get in from the other side. Just click OK on that. So that one's in. But here, let me go one more and add a port. SQL Server. Port number, the default port for SQL Server is 1433. Click OK on that. So I've got my SQL Server in place. I've got my SQL Server Management Studio already there. Click OK. And I've made 2 small holes in my firewall, figuratively speaking, of course. Now I need to do that on the other side as well. So here I am over on my yellow box, which is our subscriber, and repeat the process. Start, right click on Network, go to Properties, same song and dance, Windows Firewall here in the corner. This firewall is completely off, which makes sense. If you think about it, I was able to administer this server to set up some user accounts from the other server, and I hadn't done this yet. The firewall was completely off, but normally you want that on. So we're going to turn that back on, but make a little finer hole in it as opposed to turning the whole thing, taking the whole thing out. So add a program. I'm going to add my Management Studio again, and I'm going to add a port for SQL Server itself. SQL Server port number again is 1433. Click OK, OK again. And I'm good to go on both sides. Now this one is still showing up red, it just hasn't refreshed after being turned completely off. But we're good to go. So go ahead and close this out. And we're done setting up our firewalls. Number 4, we need to make sure we have replication installed on the publisher, distributor, if we're separating the two of those, and on my subscribers. As I mentioned before, this is something, at least the installation of replication, that you don't want to do unless you're going to be running replication. So that's why I didn't include it as part of our initial install. I wanted to demonstrate the fact that and just re-emphasize the fact that you don't install this unless you need it on. So let's do that. Now, what I need to do is install replication. All programs, SQL Server, configuration tools, and there's my installation center. Now, I created those accounts over in my domain, and if you're thinking like a SQL person, you know those accounts have to be added in to the SQL environment or they have no access. That is absolutely correct. But you also will oftentimes associate an account with a particular database. And that is true especially for our distribution account. We want to associate that with a system database that's created after I install replication. But since I haven't installed replication yet, and I should be clicking while I talk to make this go faster. Since I haven't installed replication yet, the database isn't there and I can't associate the account. So it's a lot easier. You can do the account stuff all at once if you create the database first. So I'm going to run the install again, get to the page where I'm picking features and select replication and add that in. So if you've done the install, you know this routine already, but we'll walk through it anyway. Click OK there. Click install there. Click next here. Add features. I'll just move this up so we can see it better. Click next. And I'm on my publisher, by the way. And I want to add SQL Server replication. There it is on the list. Click next. Next again. Final click. A few final clicks. And then let it chug along. Replication installed, click next. Close it out. And I'm good to go over on my publisher. So I'm on my subscriber. I've done most of the stuff so far on the publisher. But now the subscriber has to be brought up to speed. So I'm going to install replication here as well. So go and start, all programs, SQL Server, configuration tools, and installation center. Go ahead and continue with that. And it's really the exact same thing we did over on the publisher. So I'll go through this really quickly. Click OK. Click OK here. Install support files. Set up support rules. Looks good. It's noting there's a firewall, which we know. We fixed that problem. Add features to an existing instance. Click next. And then I get to pick the feature. I'm adding replication right there. Click next. Finalize that. Next my way on out. Install. Let it chug along. When that's done, the next thing I need to do is add my accounts to this server. We only added them to the publisher so far. So now we need to go back and add them to the subscriber. All done. Click next. Close it out. Replication's installed. Next, we get to configure distribution. So we've installed it, but there's some additional components that need to be created in order to run replication. One of them is the creation of a database specifically used by Replication known as a distribution database. Now, that name is not carved in stone. You do have the option of naming it whatever you choose, but the default name is the distribution database. We're going to go with that. So here, let's move over to our publisher and go through the configuration of distribution and create the distribution database. All right, let's activate Replication. I'm going to start by setting up my distribution server. So I'm on my MDM box, logged in as MDM, and I'm going to log in to Management Studio, log into the local server, and there's my Replication folder. If I right-click and go to Configure Distribution, I get the wonderful distribution wizard. Now it's asking me which server do I want to use for my distribution server. It defaults to the server I'm on, which is also our production server, by the way. And that's what I'm going to do. I don't have a really big workload, so I can get away with putting the distributor and the publisher on the same box. If I wanted to, I'd pick another one here. There's the wonderful SQL Server commercial. Let's turn that off. First time in, it's going to ask you for that. All right, next. SQL Server Agent. Do I want it to start automatically or do I want to start it manually? I'm going to tell it to start it automatically, and I'm going to go out and start it because I found that seems to work better. So let's jump over there now. Administrative Tools, Services, yes, continue. Scroll down to SQL Server Agent right there. Right click that and go to Properties, and I'm going to change that to Automatic. And I'm going to go ahead and start it now. Let that chug along while I go back over here and finish. Click Next. Where do I want the replication data to be housed? Here's the default location where it's dumping the information, and that's fine. It's under my MS SQL folder. It's creating a folder called REPL Data. If you're fine with that, great. If you want to put it somewhere else, here's your chance to do that. And production environment where you've got large numbers of transactions and you're concerned about performance, anything you can do to move something off of the primary drive where your database is located, it's always a good idea. So here will be a chance to take and distribute some of that read-write activity to another location. But for my purposes here with the Veronicas, we don't have a lot of information going back and forth through replication yet, so I'm going to leave it there. Click Next. What will be the name of my distribution database? The default name of distribution is just fine. Folder for the distribution database right here, that's fine. Or you could change that to another location again. Click Next. What publishers will be able to use this distributor? Here's where you get to determine the list, because multiple publishers could share a distributor. We only have one, so we'll leave it at that, or I could add others. Click Next. At the end of the wizard, configure distribution. That's all I want. I'm not going to generate a script to rerun this. If I wanted to rerun this exact same set of options on another box, I could save it as a script and run the script. Don't need that. Before I go any further, though, let's go check and see how my services are faring out here. Looks like my service is running. Looks good. Click OK. Close that out. Close this out, and it's started and it's set to automatic, so it'll automatically restart anytime I reboot now. Click Next again here. It's got everything it needs. Click Finish. And we're good. And if you get errors here, one of the first things I check is, did my service actually start? Is my SQL Server agent running? And that's been the most common problem at this point. But good to go. Close it out. If I go to databases now, I should have a new system database, my distribution database, as well as the folders that it created under Computer, Program Files, SQL Server. I put them here, and there's my REPL Data folder. That's my new folder. Currently don't have access to this folder, so we'll need to change that. Click Continue, and I'm in. Now there's a second step to configuring distribution. We've created our distribution database, right? And we've created our replication accounts, but the information that's going to be saved in the replication folders from the distribution database, those replication accounts don't have access to those folders necessarily by default. So we want to make sure that our replication accounts, REPL log reader, REPL distribution, REPL merge, right? Those accounts will have the necessary access that they need to those folders. So let's jump over and do that. So I'm on my production box, and what I want to do now is configure my replication accounts, the accounts we created on our domain controller, to work with SQL Server and to have access to the file system. Now, we said we'd use, or I said I would use colors to help keep track of which box I'm on, but since I changed accounts, I lost my wonderful shade of blue on my publisher because I'm running under MDM now. So switch that over, and now let's go ahead and go into Management Studio and add in some accounts. Right click on Logins, change my location, of course, to Mel's domain, click OK, and I can type these in. REPL underscore log reader, check names, I liked it, click OK. User mappings, distribution, and Veronica's. For distribution, make it an owner. Same thing for Veronica's, make it an owner. Click OK. That was log reader. REPL snapshot. Looking in the wrong location, make sure I change it to the domain. Now check name, got it. User mappings again, distribution server, make it an owner. Veronica's, make it an owner. Click OK. 2 down. Open this up, I can see I've done REPL snapshot, REPL log reader. We need to go back and get 2 more. So right click, slide this over a little bit so I can keep track of which ones I've done. Change the location again. We didn't do distribution yet, so we'll go ahead and add that one. User roles again. Obviously it's the owner of the distribution database, and it's an owner of Veronica's. 3 down, so we have REPL distribution, snapshot, log reader. 1 more, go back and get merge. Change my location again. Just type this one, REPL underscore merge. Check names, found it, good. User mappings, distribution, go ahead and make it an owner there. And Veronica's, go ahead and make it an owner there. Click OK. And I've set up the accounts to work within SQL Server. Now, the location on the hard drive where I'm going to be saving files for distribution, same thing. You need to make sure they have access to that as well. So, going out to the computer, C drive, program files, SQL Server, just drilling down to the location that we went with, this default location when we set up replication. Right clicking there, going to share, advanced sharing, continue. Go ahead and share this folder, permissions, add, looking at the domain, so that's good. Pick advanced, go to find now to list everything out there. Grab snapshot, and then holding down my shift key and my up arrow, I'm just going to grab all 4 of those at once in this case. Click OK. REPL snapshot is highlighted and needs full control. You have merge full control, log reader full control, and distribution full control. Click OK. OK again. Now going to security. It's been shared. Going to security. Again, click edit to get into the actual account names. Add. Find now, exact same song and dance here. Grab those 4 accounts. Click OK. OK again. And again, grab all 4 of these. Full control. Apply. OK. So I've done everything I need to do with my accounts on my publisher to allow them access to SQL Server as well as access to the file locations where we're going to save our replication data. So we've got distribution knocked out, and now for number 6. Here's where we get to create the actual publication. What's the information we want to package up so that we can then send it off to other boxes on the network? So let's jump over to the server and actually create our publication. So we're going to create a publication. I'm still on my publisher. Go Start, SQL Server Management Studio. Logging in locally here. If I expand my replication folder, there's a local publications folder. If I right-click on that, there's a new publication option. Select that and I get a wizard, as is typical. Click Next. It gives me a list of databases that are available for publishing. There's only one, the Veronica's, the only one we set up. Click Next. And here's a list of the different types of publications. We're going with a basic transactional publication for now. There's actually 2 types, transactional and transactional with updatable subscriptions. We want basic transactional. Click Next. Retrieving information from server. Here's a list of the objects that are available to be added to my article. And remember, an article is everything that you're including to be published, right? If I expand that list, I can see all the tables that exist under that table folder. Notice some of them have not symbols in front of them. If I click on one, it actually shows me what the problem is with those. Those tables don't have a primary key. If the table doesn't have a primary key, you can't include it in replication, which is fine, because in this case, we're going to just publish customers and flowers, just those 2. So clicking Next. Now here I get to set up a filter. A filter allows me to select which rows from a particular table get sent over to the replication server or replication destination or my subscriber. So here we're going to go ahead and do that. I'll click Add, and we can pick which table. We're going to go with customers, and let's just grab a subset of our customer data. So I just double clicked on state, and now I can put in here any standard SQL or TSQL criteria. So I'm going to go with states, and here's your little geography test. We want states only east of Illinois. And this is a test I'm not going to even try and pass, but let's just go with a few of them. Go with Virginia, love New York, and let's make sure we don't leave the far southerners out. Put Florida in there. Now it's a good idea to run and test your SQL to make sure you have that correct. So for example, I would recommend, here if we can step out of that for a second, select star, where state in, and the exact same phrase, VA, NY, FL. If I type that right, give it an F5, and it worked. I got back 5,269 rows. So that looks good. Let's go back and finish our filter. So I've got my filter in place. Go ahead and click OK. Looks good. It parsed it correctly. We're state in VA, NY, and FL. Go ahead and click Next. Click Next. Do I want to create my snapshot immediately? Yes, I do. And do I want to schedule regular periodic snapshots? I can do that here and then give it a schedule for how often it does that. Don't need that just yet, but it's there as an option. Click Next. Agent security. Remember all those accounts we set up? Here's where we associate accounts with the actual snapshot agent and the log reader agent. We went so far as to create separate accounts for each agent. You can choose how finely you want to control security. You could have one account for everything or multiple accounts. And I wanted to show you doing multiple. So I want to clear this checkbox to let it know I'm going to give it different accounts for each one. So security settings for snapshot agent, click this here, give it the domain name, / Repl snapshot. You don't get a choice of point, click, drag, and drop here, so you have to type it right. Some of the other options on the screen. I'm using a Windows account. We created a Windows domain account. I could have run this under the SQL Server service account, which, as it says here, is not recommended. You want to use separate accounts. It's easier to track, police it. And then for connecting to the publisher, do I want to go in by impersonating the process account or using an SQL Server login account? Once again, we're not using anything with SQL Server login accounts. We're doing impersonation. So click OK. Do the same thing for my log reader. You want to make sure you type these right because it will not work and the error messages aren't always the easiest to decipher. So try and make sure you're careful in getting those account names correctly and those passwords correct. Click OK again, click Next. Looks good. At the end of the wizard, do I want to create the publication? I do indeed. Do I need a script to rerun this in other environments? If you do, go ahead and click that. I'm not going to do that right now, but it's there as an option. Click Next. My publication needs a name. Since this is for our Eastern region, I'll simply call it Eastern. Click Finish and watch it chug along. There, I have successfully created my Eastern publication, so I can close this out. No errors, no warnings. And now under my local publications folder, there's my Veronica's publication. If I right click, there's a few options such as view snapshot agent status. Remember, it's creating that initial snapshot. So if I click here, I can see how far along it's gotten. And it looks like it's already done. So had I gone in maybe right away, you may have noticed that it was still processing. Depends on what else is going on with your server. Depends on how big your database is. Right? So I can close that out, and we've created our publication. So with the publication in place, there's one more security checkpoint I need to take care of. I have to give access to the publication. So if I right click, go to Properties, here I can see the properties of my publication, and if I go to Publication Access List, here I can see what accounts currently have access to my publication. Notice my MDM account is on the list, but my distribution account that I've created, my REPL distribution, which is going to distribute my publication, currently doesn't have access to the publication. So I have to specifically add it. So if I click Add, there it is at the very beginning of the list. Click OK, and my REPL distribution account is added in. So now, I'm all set with security issues for running replication. Moving on to number 7. So we've got our publication in place, distribution databases in place. So for number 7, we need to configure our subscriber. So there's some changes we need to make on the subscriber end so that it's ready to receive the information. So let's jump over to our server environment again. And this time, we'll set up our subscriber. So now we want to create our subscription. Going to my publication, if I right-click, there's a New Subscriptions option. One of many ways to get in. Brings up my New Subscription wizard. Click Next. There's my publication, our Eastern publication. It's only one there. If there were others, I could select them. Click Next. Run all agents at the distributor versus at the subscriber. We're going to do push subscriptions in this case, so we're running everything at the the distributor. So the default option is exactly what I want. Go ahead and click Next. Here's where I get to identify the subscriber. So clicking on the Add Subscriber, I have a choice of adding an SQL Server subscriber as well as a non-SQL Server subscriber. But we're going to go with an SQL Server subscriber, and there's the name of my subscriber. It's the 01 box as opposed to my local 08. Click Connect. Number 8 and 9, do these together. We're going to create our subscription. The subscription is, once again, what's the interval that we're going to send information? Right? Will it be every half hour, every 5 minutes, once a day? What's the rate that the information will be sent across the wire? That's known as creating the actual subscription. And then right after we create the subscription, we're going to turn around and verify that the data actually arrived over at the subscriber. So here, let's finish this out. I'm connected. Now I can see what databases are available. I've created my Eastern database over on my subscriber. So I can select it, click Next. More security stuff. I need to access services on my subscriber. I need to make sure my replication distribution account is set up over there. So hitting the ellipse, here I get to identify the account under which the distribution agent process will run. So here I can put in Mel's domain, Repo distribution. That's the account that's going to drive all of this. Put in the same password. Click OK. Click Next. How do I want it to run? I'm going with the default of run continuously. Go ahead and start as soon as we're done. And go ahead and create the subscriptions. Go ahead and click Next there. Give it a finish. Looks good. So we've successfully set up replication. Now how can I test it? Well, I should be sending data over to my other server. So we should be able to go over to my subscriber and see our data. So let's do that. So here I am over on my bright sunny yellow subscriber, and go to Start SQL Server Management Studio. Log in, click Connect. If I expand my databases, there's my Eastern database, tables, and there's my two tables, my customers table and my flowers table. And let's see what's in the flowers table. Right click, select first 1,000 rows or so, and there's my data. So I've managed to replicate information over to my subscriber. Way cool. So heading into the home stretch, I want to talk about a few best practices. Just simple stuff that you should implement as a bare minimum when you're doing replication. First of all, replication requires that you do some planning up front. You know, it's nice to have the latest and greatest features implemented all over your network and you can brag to your coworkers, but you know, the bottom line is, does what you're implementing support the company's bottom line? Sorry to be cliche-ish, but that's really where you need to focus, right? Am I doing something that's going to improve the productivity of my Eastern region or my folks out west? Am I making sure that they have the data they need when they need it? Second, you want to typically place your subscribers on separate computers. Typically. Not always, it's not required, but you get a lot more bang for your buck if you do. Third, carefully plan your backup strategy, which really makes sense if you think about the fact that, hey, wait a second, my data is all over the network now. Now, if you're only doing transactional replication or snapshot replication, that's not as much of an issue, but that becomes very key when you're dealing with merge replication, because now you're changing data all over the network, and the most up-to-date information may be on one server and not on another, yet each one of those two servers may have something the other one doesn't have. So now you need to be careful to time your backups along with your replication. Fourth, regularly validate your replicated data. And you can set it up and forget it if you like, but I wouldn't recommend that. You want to get back to it, check it on a regular basis. Now, what regular means is going to depend on your office, how much your data changes, and things of that nature. But you want to get back to that data on a regular basis and see, is it really doing what you expect it to do? Are you getting the data at the locations that you expect to get it at the intervals that you expect to see it? All right? But some vocabulary words that you should know. In the process of dealing with replication, we introduced some new terms. The first one, publisher. The publisher is basically the source of the replicated data. Second, we have the distributor. Think of it as the one that's passing out the cards, handles the distribution of the data. Now, it can be a separate computer, but it doesn't have to be. It depends on the workload on your system. Third, we have the subscriber, where the subscriber is simply the recipient of the replicated data. Fourth, we defined an article, which was the data, as well as any objects that need to be shared or replicated around the network. Fourth, we have our publication, which is simply a group of articles. And yes, we have this paradigm coming back to haunt us once again of a newspaper or a magazine. Think of a publication as a grouping of articles. And then we have the actual subscription, which is just a plan for who gets what information and when, who gets what publication. So what did we cover in this video? Well, first of all, we talked about the benefits of replication. Why would I want to segment my data and send portions of that data to other locations? We talked about how a remote office would probably only be interested in the information pertinent to that location. So replication gives me a way of keeping them up to date on the information that matters most to them and keeping that information local to them. Next, we talked about server roles, and there were three, right? Publisher, the one who's actually creating the data or the main data store. Distributor, the server role that's responsible for distributing the data. And in our case, we had one server provide both those capabilities. And then the third one was subscriber. Next, we looked at the three types of replication. There was transactional, right? We were sending the transactions as they happen, typically one way. Second, we looked at, or we talked about, we didn't actually implement it, but we talked about merge replication. Same thing as transactional, but now it's two-way. You've got changes happening at your central data store, and you've also got changes happening at your remote location. So now you have to send those updates both directions. And then the third type we talked about was a snapshot. And as the name indicates, it's like just a picture in time of your data. We talked about, and I showed you, the SQL Server agents involved in replication. Those are basically just Windows services, and there was a relatively long list of those. Another important thing about the SQL Server agents was we had to configure a replication folder to allow those agents to have the needed access to those locations, and then in that folder we would have the data that's going to be replicated or moved to a new server. That also required setting up system accounts for those agents. So we had to set up replication system accounts. Now in my case, we set up a separate account for every single agent that was involved. We had a distribution, we had a snapshot, right? You don't have to do it that way, but that's oftentimes the better choice because it gives you a finer level of granularity in your ability to track and control the various services. We looked at configuring transactional replication, so we walked through all the steps to actually see that one fly. We configured our publisher, we configured our distributor and our subscriber. We created our article, right? We created our articles, which are once again the individual pieces of information that we're going to replicate. All those articles pulled together created a publication. Once we had a publication, we set up a subscription. How often do you get that information? So with that, we come to the end of our video. Thank you so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.